You gotta understand something about silence. Silence isn't accidental. Silence is engineered. In places where power lives, silence is currency. And Hollywood perfected it. Not with contracts alone, not with threats you could write down, but with pressure, with favors, with doors that only open one way and slam shut real fast if you don't play along. People think silence means nothing happened. That's the biggest mistake. Silence usually means too much happened. When you're dealing with powerful people, especially ones who control careers, money, and access, silence becomes survival. You don't speak because you're weak. You don't speak because you're calculating. You're weighing the cost. You're asking yourself, what happens to me if I say this out loud? And most of the time, the answer isn't justice. It's isolation. It's being labeled difficult. It's never getting the call again. So people swallow it. They convince themselves it's the smart move. One bad moment versus a lifetime opportunity. That's the math they're forced to do. And here's the thing. Hollywood didn't just reward silence. It demanded it. Everybody knew certain things. Not details, not paperwork, but vibes, patterns, whispers, the kind of knowledge nobody admits to knowing. And when something becomes known without being spoken, it becomes protected. Because once everybody's complicit, nobody's accountable. Silence spreads faster than truth because silence feels safer. People ask, why didn't anyone say anything sooner? That question comes from the outside. From people who've never been in rooms where one wrong sentence can erase years of work. From people who don't understand how power really works when it's informal and unchecked. There's no rule book for that kind of pressure. There's no HR department. There's just influence and fear dressed up as opportunity. And for women especially, silence came with extra weight. You weren't just risking your job. You were risking your reputation. Speak up and suddenly you're dramatic, unstable, looking for attention. Or worse, you're told you misunderstood. That's how silence becomes psychological. You start questioning your own reality. You start thinking maybe keeping quiet is the mature thing, the professional thing. That's not weakness, that's conditioning. The industry liked it that way. Silence kept the machine running, movies got made, careers stayed clean on paper. The public got their red carpets and award speeches, never seeing what it cost behind the curtain. And every year that passed without someone speaking made the silence louder, heavier, harder to break. But silence doesn't erase truth. It just buries it. And buried things don't disappear, they wait. They sit there until the culture shifts, until the fear loses its grip, until someone decides the cost of staying quiet is higher than the cost of speaking. And when that moment comes, the silence doesn't look noble anymore. It looks dangerous. Because the real damage isn't just what happened. It's how long it was allowed to keep happening. And that's the part nobody can ignore anymore. See, most people don't understand the advantage of perspective until they've lived it. Growing up in a certain environment, around certain kinds of people, you see the world differently. You see the cracks other folks don't notice. The angles most people never consider. That's what gave her a different view. She wasn't just another person trying to navigate Hollywood. She had this lens, shaped by experiences most people only read about in the papers or hear whispered in back rooms. She knew how power operated. Even if she wasn't part of the system officially, she understood influence because she'd seen it work and she'd seen it destroy. And that gave her a kind of instinct that most people in Hollywood, no matter how educated or ambitious, just didn't have. Now you combine that with Hollywood itself, a place that preys on ambition, on desire, on the hunger to belong, and you've got a perfect storm. Most people walk in wide-eyed, thinking talent or hard work will get them places. But talent and work are just part of the equation. The rest, knowing who holds the cards and understanding the unspoken rules, that's where perspective becomes survival. She didn't just survive, she learned how to read the room, how to sense danger before it arrived, and how to position herself in ways that kept her safe while still moving forward. That's rare, that's valuable, that's power disguised as instinct. And here's the truth about being close to power without being fully immersed in it. You see things others can't. You notice the cracks in behavior, the patterns that repeat, the ways people manipulate the system without leaving fingerprints. Most people in Hollywood are either too scared, too naive, or too hungry to see it. But when you've grown up understanding consequences, loyalty, and betrayal on a very personal level, you're not easily fooled. You watch, you calculate, and you protect yourself. That perspective allowed her to witness things others missed, and to understand the stakes involved without ever being fully consumed by them. But it's more than just awareness. It's also about courage, and not the kind you see in movies. The courage to process what you see without getting paralyzed by it, to make decisions in an environment where one mistake could cost you everything. That kind of courage comes from experience, from understanding the consequences of every action, from growing up where decisions were literal life and death matters. She brought that into Hollywood, and that's why her story matters. Because it's not just another voice shouting after the fact. It's a voice that saw the machinery of power from the inside out, a voice that can tell you how it really worked without sugarcoating it. Most people think being connected to power means you're part of it, but that's not always true. Sometimes being close means you have the clearest view, the sharpest insights, and the instincts to survive while others are blinded by ambition. That's why her perspective was different, why her voice is crucial, and why the story she carries isn't just about events. It's about understanding the system in a way few ever do, because knowing the game is half the battle, and seeing it from the right angle, that can change everything. You ever notice how the things people don't say often carry the most weight? It's the moments behind closed doors, the whispered conversations, the meetings that never make it onto a schedule, that define the real story. That's where the truth lives, away from cameras, away from lawyers, away from the public eye. Most people only see what's on the surface, headlines, gossip, press releases. But the real story, the part that shapes everything, happens when nobody else is watching. And in that room you learn quickly who's dangerous, who's manipulative, and who's willing to bend the rules until they break someone else. It's the informal environments that are the trickiest. Not the offices, not the formal interviews, but the dinners, the after parties, the casual let's chat moments that carry more weight than any contract ever could. That's where people's true colors show. That's where boundaries get tested. That's where influence doesn't just operate, it dominates. And the problem is, when you're in that room, you're not just navigating conversation, you're navigating power. Every word, every laugh, every pause, it's all part of a larger game that most people aren't even aware they're playing. The rules are unwritten, but they're deadly serious. And that's why so many stories go untold. It's not always fear of retaliation, though that's part of it. It's more subtle than that. It's the way the system works, the way influence is wielded quietly, invisibly. You see patterns, you understand what's happening, but you also know how fragile your position is if you speak up. You see it in the faces of people who've tried and failed, in the careers that got burned, in the reputations that got tarnished simply for noticing too much. And that's the thing. Sometimes, the only way to survive is to stay quiet, even when everything inside you is screaming to expose it. But staying quiet doesn't mean nothing happened. It doesn't erase the moments, the behavior, the choices that shape the environment. Those things are real. They leave marks on careers, on reputations, on the people involved. And when someone finally decides to speak, it's not just a story, it's a reckoning. Because what was private becomes public, and suddenly the world sees the patterns that were always there, the moments that always mattered. The hidden reality, the informal meetings, the closed-door conversations, they weren't mistakes or rumors. They were the system operating exactly the way it was designed to, and everyone who saw it knew it. Most people outside of it don't realize how calculated these things are. How much strategy goes into keeping appearances clean while the real work happens out of sight. That's why her story is so powerful. Because she lived it, she saw it, and she's finally putting it into words. Not to sensationalize, not to create drama, but to reveal the mechanisms, the realities, the unspoken truths that shaped everything. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You understand how fragile the balance is, how much courage it takes to witness A and D survive, and how the real story isn't what was written down. It's what was left unsaid. Because the truth is always in the room, even if nobody talked about it. Timing is everything. You ever notice how some stories stay buried for years, and then suddenly the world is ready to hear them? It's not because the events suddenly matter more. It's because the culture changes, the climate shifts, and people realize they can listen without being swept away by fear or judgment. That's why now is the moment for this story. There comes a point when holding back no longer feels like protection. It starts to feel like betrayal, not of yourself, but of the truth, and of the people who lived it, who survived it, who were silenced. For years she carried this story in her head, in her heart, always weighing the consequences. Speaking up in Hollywood isn't like standing up in a classroom or a boardroom. There are layers of power, influence, and subtle control that make even the bravest hesitate. You calculate every word because one slip could close doors, ruin relationships, or brand you unfairly. And you're not just talking about careers. You're talking about reputation, safety, and the way people will see you for the rest of your lives. So you wait, you measure, you watch, and you survive. But culture changes, the world shifts, and suddenly silence doesn't feel like the safest option anymore. Suddenly speaking up becomes not just a risk, but a responsibility. That's what we're seeing now. People are paying attention, in ways they never did before. Conversations that used to be whispered are being amplified. Platforms exist where truth can be told without it being dismissed. And that's why she chose this moment to share what she saw, what she knows, and what she lived through. It's not just timing, it's preparation meeting opportunity, and finally, the courage to say it out loud. There's also something personal about timing. You don't tell certain truths until you've grown strong enough to carry them, until you understand them yourself. Experience teaches you what matters and what can wait. And sometimes the longer you wait, the sharper your perspective becomes. You see patterns more clearly. You understand consequences more fully. You can put words to things that used to feel inexpressible. That clarity makes the story stronger, more accurate, and more impactful. The delay isn't a weakness. It's the seasoning of insight. And let's be honest, the world also has to be ready. People have to be ready to hear, to confront, and to reflect. Stories like this aren't comfortable. They shake assumptions. They force people to face parts of themselves they'd rather ignore. But when the audience is ready, when the culture has shifted enough to handle it without destroying the messenger, that's when the story can finally breathe. That's when it has the power to change something, not just entertain or shock, but actually make a difference. So when she decided to speak, it wasn't random, it wasn't impulsive. It was the intersection of personal growth, cultural readiness, and the need for truth over fear. And that's why we're here today, because sometimes the right story, at the right time, has the ability to open eyes, wake people up, and make sure silence no longer protects what shouldn't be protected, because the moment comes when holding back is no longer an option. Power is a funny thing. Most people think it's about money or titles, about who sits at the head of the table or who gets the biggest paycheck. But real power is control. It's control over decisions, control over opportunities, control over who gets seen and who stays invisible. And when someone has that kind of power unchecked, it changes everything. It doesn't just shape the roux. It shapes behavior, it shapes choices, and it shapes lives. And the problem is the consequences don't always hit immediately. They build quietly, like a storm gathering strength, until suddenly it's impossible to ignore. Unchecked power gives people the illusion that they can act without consequence. They start believing their influence makes them untouchable, above rules, above morality. And in environments where ambition is high and fear is easy to wield, that belief can turn toxic fast. People bend, people comply, people stay quiet, not because they agree, but because survival demands it. And that's how behavior spreads. One person uses power recklessly and the next person thinks, well, that's just how it works here. The ripple effect hits everyone in the room, and soon what started as an isolated incident becomes a pattern, a system, a culture. And the consequences are real, not just for the people in power, but for everyone around them. Careers get derailed, reputations get destroyed, opportunities vanish in an instant. And it's not always legal or criminal behavior. Sometimes it's just influence exercised in ways that leave permanent scars. People internalize it. They question their own instincts, their own worth, their own ability to succeed without bending. And that's where the emotional cost hits the hardest. You might survive the storm on the outside, but the impact on your confidence, your trust, and your sense of safety lasts much longer. Accountability becomes a complicated thing in that environment. People think it's about courtrooms or headlines, about arrests or lawsuits. But real accountability is deeper than that. It's about recognizing patterns, admitting mistakes, and facing the consequences honestly. It's about the emotional toll on the people affected and the responsibility of those who wielded the power. Because even when legal systems catch up, the personal damage often remains. And those are the lessons people rarely talk about, because it's messy, and messy stories don't make it to the red carpet. What makes her story stand out is not just the events themselves, but the clarity she brings to them. She sees the system for what it was, how power was used, abused, and allowed to persist. She can trace the ripple effects, show how it shaped decisions, behavior, and outcomes for everyone involved. That kind of insight is rare, and it's why these stories matter. It's not about scandal. It's about understanding, about learning how unchecked power operates, and how accountability can be more than just a word. It can be a standard, because power without responsibility. Thank you doesn't just hurt a moment. It echoes across years, across lives, and across everyone who has to navigate the aftermath. The hardest part about stories like this isn't just surviving them, it's learning from them. And that's what matters most going forward. Because if we only focus on what happened, if we only retell the events, then the moment passes and nothing changes. But if we listen carefully, if we pay attention to the lessons, then there's a chance to make a difference. Not just for ourselves, but for the people who come after us. Speaking up, even years later, isn't about revenge or attention. It's about creating a path where honesty, accountability, and safety are part of the system, not just the exceptions. Courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's the kind of courage everyone sees. The dramatic confrontation, the public testimony, the bold headline. But more often, it's quieter. It's the courage to admit, to process, to survive, while knowing that telling the truth may disrupt everything. That's the kind of courage she had. She waited until she could tell the story fully, without hesitation, without fear clouding the details. That patience is part of the lesson. Timing and perspective matter, but courage is what transforms them into action. Creating safer environments isn't just about policies or procedures, it's about culture. It's about making it normal to speak up, to challenge behavior, to question authority without fear of reprisal. It's about ensuring that opportunities are earned through merit and integrity, not fear and compliance. And that requires all of us to be honest about the mistakes of the past. It requires reflection, accountability, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Because real change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when people refuse to look away. Preserving these stories matters for the same reason history matters. We can't learn from what we ignore. We can't improve what we refuse to see. Every story told, every truth revealed, becomes a building block for a stronger system, for a safer environment, and for a culture where influence is not a weapon but a responsibility. And the more these stories are shared, the harder it becomes for anyone to exploit the same patterns over and over again. Lessons get passed along, awareness grows, and the balance of power slowly begins to shift. And it's not just about industries like Hollywood. These lessons apply everywhere, anywhere power exists. Anywhere influence can be abused, people have to recognize the signs and act responsibly. The cost of inaction is too high. Careers, relationships, and lives are affected every time silence wins. Speaking up, even if it feels like it's too late, even if it feels uncomfortable or risky, is always better than staying quiet. Because courage has a way of inspiring courage, and truth has a way of reshaping the rules that were broken for too long. So when we look at stories like this one, we don't just remember what happened, we take the lessons with us. We learn how to recognize the warning signs. We learn how to protect ourselves and others. We learn that timing, courage, and accountability aren't just ideals, they're tools for survival and change. And most importantly, we learn that sharing the story, no matter how late, can make the future safer, fairer, and stronger for everyone. Because the real victory comes when silence is replaced with action.